Have you ever wondered what happens when love blooms in the most impossible circumstances? When the entire world tells you that caring for someone could cost you everything, yet your heart refuses to listen. Tonight, I'm going to share with you one of the most extraordinary and forbidden love stories from World War II. A tale that will challenge everything you think you know about humanity during history's darkest hour. Picture this. It's 1943, and Britain stands as a fortress against Nazi Germany. Every citizen knows the rules. Every person understands their duty. The enemy is clear, the lines are drawn, and fraternizing with the opposition means certain death. But what happens when a young British nurse finds herself face to face with a German soldier who has abandoned everything he once believed in? What happens when compassion collides with patriotism, when love defies the boundaries of war itself? This is the story of Margaret Ashworth, a dedicated nurse working in a countryside hospital, and Hans Mueller, a Wehrmacht deserter who risked everything to escape the horrors he could no longer stomach. Their paths should never have crossed. Their hearts should never have connected. Yet, in the chaos of war, the most unlikely connections often prove to be the most profound. Before we dive into this incredible journey, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. This isn't just another wartime romance. This is a testament to the power of human connection to transcend even the most insurmountable barriers. It's proof that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't following orders, but following your conscience. And it's a reminder that love, real love, doesn't recognize the artificial boundaries that politics and war try to create. I've spent months researching stories like this, diving deep into archives, speaking with historians, and uncovering testimonies that have been buried for decades. What I discovered will shake you to your core. Because this story isn't unique. Across occupied Europe, countless individuals made impossible choices, choosing humanity over hatred, love over loyalty to a cause they no longer believed in. But Margaret and Hans? Their story is different. Their story is one of the most documented cases we have of forbidden love during the Second World War, and the choices they made will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about right and wrong during wartime. So, settle in, because we're about to embark on a journey that begins in the rolling hills of Yorkshire, where a young woman dedicated her life to healing others, completely unaware that she was about to face the greatest moral test of her generation. Margaret Ashworth was 24 years old when our story begins, working as a senior nurse at Whitmoor General Hospital, a converted manor house that served wounded soldiers returning from the European front. She had joined the nursing corps in 1940, driven by an unwavering desire to serve her country and save lives. Her colleagues knew her as someone who never gave up on a patient, no matter how hopeless the case seemed. Every morning, Margaret would arrive at the hospital before dawn, her auburn hair pinned back in the regulation style, her uniform pressed and pristine. She moved through the wards with quiet efficiency, checking on soldiers who had been broken by battle, offering comfort to those who cried out in their sleep, and writing letters home for men whose hands could no longer hold a pen. The work was exhausting. The constant stream of wounded men, the shortage of supplies, the knowledge that every patient she helped heal would likely return to the front lines, all of it weighed heavily on her shoulders. But Margaret found purpose in the small victories. A fever that broke in the night, a wound that healed cleaner than expected, a smile from a patient who had given up hope just days before. She had no time for romance. The war had claimed most of the eligible men in her village, and those who remained were either too young or too old to serve. Margaret told herself that love was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when there were lives to save, not when her country needed every ounce of her dedication. But fate, as it often does, had different plans entirely. The autumn of 1943 brought news of increasing German desertion rates. British intelligence reported that Wehrmacht soldiers were abandoning their posts in unprecedented numbers, fleeing westward toward Allied lines. Most were captured immediately and sent to prisoner-of-war camps. Others disappeared entirely, presumed dead in the countryside. Hans Mueller was different. A former law student from Prussia, he had been conscripted in 1941 at the age of 22. Unlike many of his contemporaries who embraced the Nazi ideology with fervor, Hans had watched in growing horror as the war revealed its true nature. He witnessed atrocities that made him question everything he had been taught about duty and honor. The breaking point came during a village clearing operation in occupied France when he was ordered to participate in actions that violated every moral principle he held dear. That night, Hans made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He would desert. He would flee westward, toward Britain, hoping to find sanctuary among the very people his country had branded as enemies. It was a journey that would take him across hostile territory, through forests and fields, surviving on scraps and rainwater, always one step ahead of the military police, who hunted deserters with ruthless efficiency. For 3 weeks, Hans traveled by night and hid by day. He spoke no English beyond the most basic phrases, carried no identification that wouldn't immediately mark him as an enemy combatant, and had no plan beyond reaching the British coast. His uniform was torn and muddy. His boots were falling apart, and exhaustion had carved deep lines into his young face. It was on a cold October morning that Hans's strength finally gave out. He had been walking for 14 hours straight, driven by the sound of search dogs in the distance, when he collapsed near a stone wall bordering the grounds of Whitmoor General Hospital. His body, pushed beyond its limits, simply refused to carry him any further. This is where our story truly begins, because it was Margaret who found him there, unconscious and barely breathing, his German uniform barely visible beneath layers of mud and torn fabric. In that moment, she faced a choice that would define not just her own fate, but the fate of the man lying helpless before her. The sensible thing, the patriotic thing, would have been to alert the authorities immediately. Hans was an enemy soldier, regardless of his reasons for being there. By law, by duty, by every social expectation of wartime Britain, Margaret should have turned him in without hesitation. But as she knelt beside his unconscious form, checking his pulse and examining his wounds, something stirred within her that had nothing to do with politics or patriotism. She saw not a Nazi soldier, but a human being in desperate need of medical attention. His face, even marked by exhaustion and hardship, was gentle, young, vulnerable in a way that reminded her of the countless patients she had nursed back to health. Margaret looked around the empty field, her heart pounding as she weighed her options. The hospital was less than 100 yards away. Her colleagues would be arriving soon for the morning shift. She had perhaps 10 minutes to decide what to do with the man who had literally fallen into her life. She thought about her oath as a nurse, the promise to do no harm, to preserve life wherever she found it. She thought about her duty to her country, the expectations of a nation at war. She thought about the consequences of harboring an enemy soldier, the court-martial that would surely follow if she were discovered, the disgrace that would fall upon her family. But, as Hans stirred slightly, mumbling something in German that sounded like a plea for help, Margaret's decision crystallized with startling clarity. She couldn't leave him there to die. She couldn't turn him over to authorities without at least ensuring he would survive. Her conscience, her very soul, wouldn't allow it. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that neither Margaret nor Hans could have anticipated. A secret that would bind them together in ways they never imagined possible. A love story that would unfold in the shadows of war, challenging every belief they held about loyalty, duty, and the true meaning of courage. But that's where we'll pause for now, because what comes next in this extraordinary tale will shock you in ways you never expected. Ways you never expected. Margaret made her choice in that frozen moment beside the stone wall. She couldn't carry Hans alone, but she knew exactly where to take him. The old groundskeeper's cottage sat abandoned at the far edge of the hospital property, hidden behind a grove of ancient oak trees. It had been empty since old Thomas passed away the previous winter, and Margaret was one of the few people who still had a key. Working quickly, she managed to half-carry, half-drag the unconscious German soldier across the field. His body was heavier than she expected, dead weight, that made her muscles scream with effort. Every few steps she had to stop and listen for voices, terrified that someone might discover them. The morning mist provided some cover, but it wouldn't last long. The cottage was musty and cold when she finally got him inside. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through grimy windows. Margaret laid Hans on the narrow bed that still occupied the main room, her nurse's training taking over despite the extraordinary circumstances. She checked his pulse again, examined the cuts on his hands and face, and noted the signs of severe dehydration and exhaustion. He needed medical attention, but she couldn't risk bringing him to the hospital. Instead, Margaret did something she had never done before in her career. She began treating a patient in complete secrecy, using supplies she would have to steal from the hospital stores without anyone noticing. Over the next few days, Margaret lived 2 separate lives. During her shifts, she was the same dedicated nurse her colleagues had always known, efficient and caring, showing no signs of the enormous secret she carried. But every spare moment was spent at the cottage, tending to the German deserter who had stumbled into her world. Hans remained unconscious for the first 36 hours. Margaret began to worry that his condition was more serious than she had initially assessed. She brought him water, spooning small amounts between his lips when he seemed responsive enough to swallow. She cleaned his wounds with supplies smuggled from the hospital, changed his torn clothing with garments she found in the cottage's old wardrobe. It was on the 3rd morning that Hans finally opened his eyes. Margaret was checking his temperature when she noticed him watching her, his gaze confused but alert. For a moment, neither of them moved. The enormity of the situation crashed over both of them simultaneously. She was a British nurse. He was a German soldier. By every law of war, they were enemies. Hans tried to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. Margaret realized he was attempting to communicate in broken English, piecing together fragments he must have learned somewhere along his journey. "Thank you," he managed to say, the words heavily accented but unmistakable. Margaret found herself looking into eyes that held no malice, no trace of the fanaticism she had been taught to expect from Nazi soldiers. Instead, she saw exhaustion, gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like shame. This was not the face of a man who believed in the cause he had been fighting for. "You're safe," she whispered back, though even as she said it, she knew how untrue those words were. Neither of them was safe. Not anymore. Over the following days, as Hans slowly regained his strength, they began to communicate in a mixture of his limited English and gestures that transcended language barriers. Margaret learned that he had been walking for weeks, surviving on whatever food he could find, drinking from streams and puddles. He had crossed occupied France, made it through the Channel by hiding aboard a fishing vessel, and then walked across half of England before collapsing near her hospital. What struck her most was his story of desertion. Hans didn't try to glorify his decision or present himself as a hero. Instead, he spoke with quiet anguish about the things he had witnessed, the orders he could no longer follow, the moment when his conscience had finally overcome his fear. He had abandoned everything he had ever known, everyone he had ever loved, because staying meant becoming something he couldn't live with. Margaret found herself drawn to this unexpected vulnerability. She had treated hundreds of soldiers, both British and captured Germans who were brought to the hospital, but she had never encountered someone who spoke so honestly about the moral weight of warfare, about the impossible choices that conflict forced upon ordinary people. Their conversations, conducted in whispers during her brief visits, began to reveal the human being behind the uniform. Hans told her about his studies in law, his dreams of becoming a prosecutor who would fight for justice. He spoke of his family's small estate in Prussia, his younger sister who wrote poetry, his mother who grew roses in their garden. These details painted a picture so different from the propaganda images of faceless Nazi soldiers that Margaret had been conditioned to accept. In return, Margaret found herself sharing parts of her own life she rarely discussed with anyone. She told him about her decision to become a nurse, her determination to serve her country by healing rather than harming. She described the patients who haunted her dreams, the young men who cried out for their mothers in languages she couldn't understand, the letters she had written to families whose sons would never return home. As the days passed, their relationship evolved from caregiver and patient into something neither had anticipated. They discovered shared interests in literature and philosophy, debating ethics and morality in their limited common vocabulary. Hans had managed to carry a small book of poetry through his entire journey, and he would read to her in German while she tried to guess the meanings from his expressions and gestures. Margaret began to look forward to these stolen moments at the cottage with an intensity that frightened her. She told herself it was simply professional concern for a patient who needed her care. But she couldn't deny the way her heart raced when she saw his face light up at her arrival, or the warmth that spread through her chest when he smiled at something she had said. The danger of their situation became increasingly apparent as the weeks passed. Hospital staff had begun commenting on Margaret's frequent absences, her distracted demeanor during shifts. Supplies were going missing from the medical stores, small amounts that she hoped wouldn't be noticed but which accumulated into a significant risk. Most concerning of all, there had been reports of German deserters in the area, leading to increased patrols and searches. Hans recovered his strength faster than Margaret had expected. Within 2 weeks, he was able to walk around the cottage to help her with small tasks during her visits. His presence filled the tiny space in a way that made it feel less like a hideout and more like a sanctuary. But both of them knew this arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. The first real crisis came when Margaret arrived at the cottage one evening to find Hans standing at the window, his body tense with alarm. He had heard voices nearby, British soldiers conducting a routine patrol of the hospital grounds. They were getting closer to the cottage, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. Margaret's mind raced through their options. The cottage had nowhere to hide, no secret passages or hidden rooms. If the patrol decided to investigate the building, they would find Hans immediately. Her medical career would be over. Her life as she knew it would end. But more than that, Hans would face execution as a deserter and spy. Without hesitation, Margaret made another choice that would bind their fates even more tightly together. She told Hans to stay hidden while she went out to meet the patrol, positioning herself as a barrier between them and the cottage. The soldiers were closer than she had realized. Margaret could see their silhouettes moving between the trees, methodical and thorough in their search pattern. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped out into the night air, pulling her nursing cloak tight around her shoulders. "Good evening," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The beam of a flashlight swung toward her, momentarily blinding her as the patrol leader approached. "Miss Ashworth, isn't it?" The sergeant's voice carried recognition. She knew him from the hospital where he had visited wounded men from his unit. "What brings you out here so late?" Margaret's mind scrambled for a plausible explanation. "I thought I heard something earlier during my shift. Probably just foxes, but I wanted to check the old cottage. We've had reports of vagrants sheltering in abandoned buildings." The sergeant nodded, his expression relaxing slightly. "We're conducting sweeps of the entire area. Intelligence suggests there might be enemy infiltrators in the region. Have you noticed anything unusual?" "Anyone who doesn't belong?" The weight of her deception pressed down on her like a physical force. Behind the cottage walls, Hans was listening to every word, understanding enough English now to grasp the deadly nature of their situation. One wrong answer, one moment of hesitation, and both their lives would be forfeit. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Margaret replied, amazed at how naturally the lie rolled off her tongue. "The cottage has been empty since Thomas passed. I check it occasionally, but there's never been any sign of disturbance." The sergeant studied her face in the dim light. Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze directly, drawing on every ounce of composure her nursing training had taught her. Life and death situations required calm thinking, steady hands, unwavering focus. This was no different. "Well, we'll take a quick look around anyway," the sergeant said, starting toward the cottage door. "Standard procedure." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She had seconds to act, to find some way to prevent the search without arousing suspicion. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one seeming more desperate than the last. "Sergeant," she said quickly, "I should mention that I've been using the cottage to store some medical supplies. Overflow from the hospital. Nothing valuable, just basic bandages and such, but I wouldn't want there to be any confusion about missing inventory." It was a calculated risk. By claiming ownership of whatever they might find inside, she hoped to provide cover for the medical supplies she had brought to treat Hans. But it also meant she would be present during any search, unable to warn him or create a distraction. The sergeant paused, considering this information. "Medical supplies should be properly secured, Miss Ashworth. Hospital property shouldn't be stored in unauthorized locations." "You're absolutely right," Margaret agreed. "I'll speak with the head nurse tomorrow about proper storage procedures. It was a temporary solution to our space shortage, but clearly not appropriate." For a moment that felt like an eternity, the sergeant weighed her words. Margaret could sense his internal debate, the balance between thoroughness and efficiency that guided every military decision. Behind him, his men waited for orders, their weapons ready, their training focused on finding enemies of the state. "Very well," he said finally, "but I want those supplies moved back to the hospital immediately. We can't have medical resources scattered across the countryside." Relief flooded through Margaret's body like warm water. "Of course, Sergeant. First thing tomorrow morning." The patrol moved on, their voices fading as they continued their systematic search of the hospital grounds. Margaret remained outside the cottage for several minutes, listening to ensure they were truly gone before slipping back inside. She found Hans pressed against the far wall, his face pale with tension. The moment she entered, he moved toward her, and without thinking, she found herself in his arms. It was the first time they had embraced, the first acknowledgement of the bond that had been growing between them through weeks of shared danger and whispered conversations. "I thought they would find me," Hans murmured against her hair. "I thought this would be the end." Margaret pulled back to look at his face, struck by how much he had changed since that first morning when she found him unconscious by the stone wall. The hollow-cheeked desperation was gone, replaced by something warmer, but no less intense. His eyes held depths she was still discovering, layers of experience and emotion that drew her in despite every rational instinct that told her to maintain distance. "We can't continue like this," she whispered. "It's too dangerous. For both of us." Hans nodded, but his hands remained on her shoulders as if letting go would somehow make the danger more real. "I know. I have known for days that I must leave. But Margaret, I must tell you something first." The way he spoke her name, with that slight German accent that softened the harsh consonants, made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She realized that somewhere in the midst of hiding him, caring for him, talking with him through the long evening hours, she had begun to love him. It was an impossible love, one that defied every social convention and moral boundary of their time. He was German, she was British. He was a deserter, she was bound by duty to her country. Their nations were locked in a death struggle that had already claimed millions of lives. By every measure of logic and loyalty, what she felt for him was not just inappropriate, but treasonous. Yet standing there in the dim cottage light, feeling the warmth of his hands on her shoulders, Margaret couldn't bring herself to care about any of those obstacles. The war had taught her that life was fragile, that happiness was rare, that love was perhaps the only force powerful enough to make sense of a senseless world. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew what he was going to say. "I love you," Hans said simply. "I know it is impossible. I know it changes nothing about our situation. but I cannot leave without telling you that these weeks with you have been the only light in years of darkness." Margaret felt tears she hadn't realized were forming spill down her cheeks. She had spent so long focused on duty and service that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, by another person. Hans looked at her not as a nurse or a British citizen or an enemy, but simply as Margaret, the woman who had chosen compassion over caution, who had risked everything for a stranger, who had found her way to love in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both natural and revolutionary. "God help me. I love you too." They held each other in the cottage that had become their sanctuary, surrounded by the evidence of their impossible situation, medical supplies that marked her as a thief, German phrases scrawled on scraps of paper that marked her as a collaborator, a love that marked them both as traitors to everything their respective societies demanded of them. But in that moment, none of it mattered. There was only the truth of what they felt for each other, the recognition of souls that had found their match despite every obstacle the world had placed in their path. Hans was the first to speak again, his voice heavy with the weight of practical reality. "I must go soon. Every day I remain here increases the danger to you. I cannot bear the thought of bringing harm to the woman who saved my life." Margaret knew he was right, but the thought of losing him felt like a physical blow. She had found something precious and rare, and now she would have to let it go for the sake of both their survival. "Where will you go?" she asked. "I do not know. Perhaps I can reach Ireland, find passage to America? Or maybe I will simply disappear into the countryside, become someone else entirely? What matters is that you will be safe." They began planning his departure with the same careful attention to detail that had kept him hidden for weeks. Margaret would gather supplies for his journey, enough food and medical materials to sustain him for several days of travel. Hans would leave before dawn, using the cover of darkness to put distance between himself and the hospital. But even as they made these practical arrangements, both of them struggled with the emotional reality of separation. They had found each other against impossible odds, discovered a love that transcended the hatred dividing their nations. Now they would have to trust that somehow, someday, the world would change enough to allow them to be together again. The night before his planned departure, they sat together in the cottage, sharing what they both knew might be their final conversation. Hans had taught Margaret a few German phrases while she had helped him practice English sentences he might need during his journey. Their languages were mixing, creating a private vocabulary that belonged only to them. "Promise me something," Margaret said as dawn approached. "Promise me that if we survive this war, if we both make it through, you will find a way to contact me." Hans took her hands in his, studying her face as if memorizing every detail. "I promise, though I do not know how long this war will last or what the world will look like when it ends." "Neither do I," Margaret admitted, "but I have to believe that love this strong doesn't just disappear. I have to believe that what we've found here means something beyond these few weeks." As the first pale light of dawn crept through the cottage windows, they prepared for a goodbye that felt like a small death. Margaret had prepared everything Hans would need for his journey, including a letter of introduction she had forged claiming he was a Belgian refugee seeking passage to neutral territory. Their final morning together passed in a blur of desperate preparation and unspoken fears. Hans checked his meager belongings one last time, while Margaret made final adjustments to the forged documents that might save his life. The letter she had written claimed he was a Belgian refugee named Henri Dubois, seeking safe passage to neutral Switzerland. Her handwriting looked official enough, she hoped, to fool a casual inspection. "Your English has improved so much," Margaret whispered as they went over his cover story one final time. "Remember, keep your answers short. If anyone asks detailed questions about Belgium, claim you're too traumatized by what you witnessed to speak of it." Hans nodded, though they both knew how fragile this deception would be under serious scrutiny. One wrong accent, One misunderstood question, and his true identity would be exposed. Still, it was better than traveling with no documentation at all. The cottage felt different now, charged with the electricity of impending separation. Every object seemed to hold significance. The narrow bed where Hans had recovered his strength, the small table where they had shared stolen meals, the window where they had watched for patrols while learning each other's languages and dreams. Margaret found herself memorizing details she had never noticed before. The way Hans unconsciously ran his fingers through his hair when he was thinking. The slight scar above his left eyebrow from some childhood accident. The gentle way he handled even the smallest objects, as if years of witnessing destruction had made him treasure anything that remained whole. "I need to return to the hospital soon," she said, though every fiber of her being resisted the idea of leaving him. "My shift begins in 2 hours, and I cannot be late. Not today." Hans understood the subtext. Today, of all days, she needed to appear completely normal. Any deviation from her usual routine might draw attention at the worst possible moment. They both knew that their secret had survived this long, partly through luck, but mostly through Margaret's careful attention to maintaining her regular patterns. "Before you go," Hans said quietly, "there is something I want you to have." He reached into his jacket and withdrew the small book of poetry that had accompanied him throughout his entire journey. The leather cover was worn smooth by constant handling, the pages yellowed and soft from countless readings. Margaret had watched him turn these pages during their evenings together, sometimes reading aloud in German while she tried to guess the meaning from his expressions. "I cannot carry this where I am going," he continued, "but perhaps someday, when you read these words, you will think of me." Margaret accepted the book with trembling hands. It felt heavier than its size suggested, weighted with all the meaning he was placing in this gesture. She opened it carefully, seeing German text that remained largely mysterious to her, but also noticing something new. In the margins of several pages, Hans had penciled English translations of his favorite verses. One passage caught her eye immediately. His translation read, "Love is the bridge between two hearts, stronger than the walls that would divide them." She looked up to find him watching her reaction, his eyes soft with vulnerability. "It is by Rilke," Hans explained. "I copied it from memory during one of our evenings together. I thought you should understand what the words mean." Margaret felt fresh tears threatening to spill. This small book represented more than poetry. It was a piece of his soul, something precious enough that he had carried it through weeks of desperate flight. Now he was entrusting it to her, creating a tangible connection that would survive their separation. "I will treasure this always," she whispered. "And Hans, I want you to have something as well." She unfastened the small silver locket she wore around her neck, a piece that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside was a tiny photograph of herself from her nursing school graduation, formal and serious in her crisp uniform. It wasn't much, but it was personal, intimate, in the way that only small keepsakes could be. "So, you will not forget my face," Margaret said as she placed the chain in his palm. Hans closed his fingers around the locket, holding it as if it were made of the most delicate crystal. "I could never forget. Even if I live to be an old man, even if decades pass, I will remember every detail of your face." They embraced then, holding each other with desperate intensity. Margaret breathed in his scent, trying to imprint it in her memory alongside all the other details she would need to sustain her through the uncertain future. His arms around her felt like safety in a world gone mad, like home in a time when that concept had lost all meaning for both of them. "I must go," she finally whispered against his shoulder. "If I stay any longer, I will not have the strength to leave it all." Hans released her reluctantly, his hands lingering on her face as if trying to memorize its contours through touch. "Remember what I promised you. When this war ends, I will find you. No matter how long it takes, no matter how far I must travel." Margaret nodded, though speaking had become difficult around the tightness in her throat. She gathered her cloak and the empty medical bag that would explain her presence near the cottage if anyone questioned her. At the door, she turned back for one final look. Hans stood in the center of the small room, surrounded by the evidence of their impossible love story. Morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating his face with a golden glow that made him appear almost ethereal. Margaret tried to capture this image in her mind, knowing it might have to sustain her through whatever came next. "Until we meet again," she said softly. "Until we meet again," Hans replied. "Ich liebe dich, Margaret." She slipped out into the morning air, forcing herself not to look back again. The walk to the hospital felt surreal, as if she were moving through a dream where everything appeared normal, but nothing actually made sense. Other staff members were arriving for their shifts, calling out cheerful greetings that she managed to return with appropriate enthusiasm. Margaret threw herself into her work that day with unusual intensity, as if staying busy could somehow quiet the ache in her chest. She changed bandages with meticulous care, administered medications with precise timing, and wrote patient notes with unnecessary detail. Her colleagues commented on her exceptional focus, unaware that it was the only thing preventing her from breaking down entirely. During her lunch break, she made one final trip to the cottage. Hans was gone, as planned, leaving behind only the faintest traces of his presence. The bed was neatly made, the small pile of medical supplies she had left for him was missing, and a brief note lay on the table. "Thank you for giving me back my humanity," it read in his careful English handwriting. "You saved more than my life. You saved my soul." Margaret folded the note carefully and placed it inside the poetry book, creating a small archive of their time together. Then she gathered the few remaining items that might indicate someone had been living in the cottage, erasing the last physical evidence of their secret. As she walked back to the hospital, Margaret realized that her life had been permanently altered by these past weeks. She would continue her work as a nurse, continue serving wounded soldiers and maintaining the facade of dedicated patriotism. But part of her would always remain in that cottage, in those stolen moments when she discovered what it meant to love someone completely despite every rational argument against it. The war continued around her, as wars do, indifferent to individual human drama. Patients arrived and departed, some healing and returning to battle, others succumbing to wounds that proved too severe for even her skilled care. Margaret performed her duties with the same dedication she had always shown, but now there was an added dimension to her compassion. Every German prisoner who passed through the hospital received her particular attention, not because she saw Hans in their faces, but because she now understood that beneath every uniform was a human being capable of doubt, of moral struggle, of love that transcended political boundaries. Her secret experience had given her a perspective that few of her contemporaries could share. Weeks passed, then months, with no word from Hans. Margaret had not expected communication, knowing how dangerous any contact would be for both of them. Still, she found herself scanning every letter delivery, hoping against hope for some sign that he had survived his journey to whatever sanctuary he had sought. The poetry book became her secret companion. During quiet moments between shifts, she would study the German text, slowly teaching herself to read the language that Hans had spoken with such gentle precision. Each new word she learned felt like a small victory, a way of maintaining their connection across the silence that separated them. Winter arrived with unusual harshness, bringing heavy snows that transformed the countryside into a pristine white landscape. The hospital struggled with increased heating costs and supply shortages, while the staff worked longer hours to accommodate the steady stream of casualties from the European front. It was during one of these difficult winter nights that Margaret received news that would shake the foundations of her carefully maintained composure. A new batch of German prisoners had arrived at the hospital, men captured during a recent offensive, who required medical treatment before being transferred to permanent internment facilities. Among them was a young soldier who bore a striking resemblance to Hans. The same build, the same coloring, even similar facial features that made Margaret's heart skip when she first saw him. For a wild moment, she wondered if somehow Hans had been recaptured, if their separation had led him back into the very situation he had fled. But as she approached the patient's bedside, she realized her mistake. This was not Hans, but someone who might have been his brother. The resemblance was uncanny, yet the essential spark that had drawn her to Hans was absent. This soldier's eyes held the fanatical gleam she had expected to see in Hans but never had. This was a true believer, someone who embraced the ideology that Hans had rejected. Still, caring for this patient became a strange form of penance for Margaret. She found herself wondering what Hans would think if he knew she was tending to someone who represented everything he had turned away from. Would he understand that her compassion extended even to those whose beliefs she found abhorrent? Or would he see it as a betrayal of the principles that had brought them together? The prisoner recovered quickly under her care, his youth and previously excellent health serving him well. Unlike Hans, who had been grateful for every small kindness, this young man remained sullen and hostile. He refused to acknowledge her efforts, treating her with the contempt that Nazi ideology reserved for women in general and enemy women in particular. Margaret found these interactions deeply unsettling, not because of the patient's attitude toward her, but because they highlighted the remarkable nature of her relationship with Hans. He had been different from the beginning, she realized, not just because circumstances had led him to question his allegiance, but because his fundamental character was incompatible with the hatred his government promoted. As spring approached, bringing news of Allied advances and growing hope for eventual victory, Margaret allowed herself to imagine what peace might look like. Would Hans find his way back to her as he had promised? Would the end of hostilities create opportunities for connections that were impossible during wartime? She had no answers to these questions, only the faith that their love had been real enough to survive whatever trials lay ahead. The poetry book remained her constant companion, its pages now familiar territory that she could navigate in both German and English. Sometimes she would read aloud in Hans's native language, imagining his voice speaking the words alongside her own. The cottage where they had sheltered their impossible love remained empty, gradually returning to the state of abandonment it had known before their brief occupation. Margaret visited occasionally, not from any practical necessity, but from a need to touch base with the place where she had discovered depths of herself she never knew existed. Standing in that small room where they had planned their future and prepared for their separation, Margaret could almost feel Hans's presence lingering in the shadows. The memory of his voice reading poetry in the evening light, the warmth of his embrace during those final precious hours, the weight of his promise that he would find her when the world allowed such reunions. She had changed during those weeks of secrecy, evolved into someone capable of defying convention when love demanded it. The quiet, dutiful nurse who had found an unconscious enemy soldier by a stone wall was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that the most profound moral choices often required breaking the rules that others lived by. Margaret carried this transformation with her through the remaining years of the war, through the celebration of victory, and into the uncertain peace that followed. She never spoke of Hans to anyone, never shared the story of their forbidden love or the choices she had made to protect him. But she waited, as she had promised she would. Through the chaos of post-war reconstruction, through the gradual healing of a continent torn apart by conflict, through all the small dramas and large changes that marked the return to normal life, Margaret waited for the sound of a familiar voice speaking her name with a slight German accent that made her heart skip. The poetry book grew more worn with each passing year, its pages soft from constant handling, its margins filled with notes and translations that marked her growing fluency in the language Hans had taught her to love. Each poem became a prayer, each verse a hope that somewhere in the world, a man who had once deserved was thinking of her with the same intensity she brought to thoughts of him. Of him. The years after the war brought changes that Margaret could never have anticipated. The world she had known, with its clear divisions between ally and enemy, dissolved into something far more complex. Former enemies became allies, occupied territories regained independence, and millions of displaced people began the long journey toward finding new homes. Margaret remained at Whitmoor General as it transitioned from a military hospital back to civilian service. The wards that had once echoed with the groans of wounded soldiers now filled with different sounds. Children recovering from illnesses that peacetime medicine could finally address properly. Elderly patients who had deferred treatment during the war years. Accident victims whose injuries spoke of industrial progress rather than battlefield trauma. She had been promoted to head nurse, a position that brought increased responsibilities but also greater freedom to shape how the hospital operated. Margaret used this authority to implement policies that reflected the hard-won wisdom of her wartime experiences. Every patient received the same standard of care regardless of their background, nationality, or circumstances. It was a principle that sometimes raised eyebrows among staff members who remembered the fierce patriotism of the war years. But Margaret had learned something during those weeks with Hans that her colleagues could never understand. She had discovered that healing transcended politics, that compassion could not be rationed according to the artificial boundaries that nations drew on maps. The enemy soldier she had sheltered and loved had taught her lessons about humanity that no medical textbook could provide. The poetry book remained her most treasured possession, though she had long since memorized its contents. She kept it in her bedside drawer, taking it out during quiet evenings to read passages that transported her back to those stolen moments in the cottage. Her German had improved dramatically over the years, aided by correspondence courses and conversations with the growing number of displaced persons who passed through the hospital. Sometimes she wondered if her dedication to learning Hans's language was a form of madness, a refusal to accept that their separation might be permanent. But she couldn't bring herself to abandon this connection to him, this tangible link to the man who had changed her understanding of love and loyalty forever. The hospital received occasional visits from international relief organizations, groups working to reunite families separated by the war. Margaret volunteered for these programs whenever possible, not because she expected to find Hans through official channels, but because she understood the desperation of those searching for lost loved ones. Every reunion she witnessed felt like a small victory, proof that love could survive even the most devastating circumstances. One autumn afternoon in 1948, Margaret was reviewing patient charts when her assistant knocked on her office door. "There's a gentleman here asking about wartime medical records," the young woman said. "He's with some sort of refugee assistance program. Says he's trying to trace people who might have received treatment here during the war." Margaret's heart began beating faster, though she forced herself to remain calm. Such inquiries had become routine as various organizations worked to document the massive displacement of populations during the conflict. Still, something about this particular request felt different. "Send him in," she said, straightening papers on her desk to give her hand something to do. The man who entered her office was middle-aged, wearing a worn but well-maintained suit that spoke of careful attention to appearance despite limited resources. He introduced himself as Dr. Wilhelm Hoffmann, representing a Swiss-based organization dedicated to helping war refugees locate missing family members. "Miss Ashworth," he began in accented but fluent English, "I understand you were head nurse here during the war years. I'm hoping you might remember treating certain individuals who may have passed through your facility." Margaret nodded professionally, though her pulse continued racing. "We treated many patients during that time, both Allied personnel and German prisoners of war. Our records from that period are somewhat incomplete due to wartime conditions. Dr. Hoffman opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several photographs. I am particularly interested in locating a young German man who may have been in this area sometime in 1943. His name is Hans Mueller, formerly of the Wehrmacht, but believed to have deserted his unit. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Margaret stared at the photograph Dr. Hoffman placed on her desk. It was Hans, unmistakably Hans, though the image appeared to have been taken before the war. He looked younger, his face fuller, and unmarked by the hardship she had witnessed. But those eyes were the same ones that had looked at her with such tenderness during their final morning together. Margaret fought to keep her expression neutral, drawing on years of nursing experience that had taught her to maintain composure in crisis situations. "May I ask why you are seeking this particular individual?" "His sister has been searching for him since the war ended," Dr. Hoffman explained. "She managed to escape from East Prussia before the Soviet advance and has been living in a displaced persons camp in Bavaria. She received word through former Wehrmacht contacts that her brother had deserted and fled westward, possibly reaching England." The mention of Hans's sister sent a shock through Margaret's system. He had spoken of her often during their time together, describing a young woman who wrote poetry and tended their mother's rose garden. To know that she had survived, that she was actively searching for her lost brother, added an entirely new dimension to the situation. "I see," Margaret said carefully. "And if you were to locate this Hans Mueller, what would happen to him?" "Desertion was considered a serious crime by German military law." Dr. Hoffman's expression softened slightly. "Miss Ashworth, the world has changed considerably since 1945. Many former deserters have been granted amnesty, particularly those who can demonstrate they fled due to moral objections to Nazi policies. This young man's sister believes her brother left the army because he could no longer participate in actions he found unconscionable." Margaret studied the photograph again, remembering Hans's anguished words about the atrocities he had witnessed, the breaking point that had driven him to abandon everything he had known. His sister's assessment aligned perfectly with the man she had come to love. And so Margaret made one final choice that would define the rest of her life. She looked Dr. Hoffman directly in the eyes and said simply, "I'm sorry, but I have no record of treating anyone by that name during the war years." The lie came as naturally as breathing, born from the same protective instinct that had first led her to shelter a dying enemy soldier by a stone wall. Dr. Hoffman gathered his papers with visible disappointment, thanking her for her time before departing into the autumn afternoon. Margaret sat alone in her office, holding Hans's photograph until her hands stopped trembling. She had protected him one final time, choosing his safety over the desperate hope of reunion that had sustained her through 5 long years. Some love stories end with passionate embraces and wedding bells. Others end with quiet acts of sacrifice that echo through eternity. Margaret never learned whether Hans survived his journey to freedom, never discovered if he built the new life he had dreamed of in some distant country. But she carried their love like a sacred flame, proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion could triumph over hatred, and two hearts could find each other across the vast divide of war. The poetry book remained on her bedside table until the day she died, its pages worn thin by countless readings, its margins filled with translations that kept their private language alive. And sometimes, late at night when the hospital was quiet, Margaret would whisper German phrases into the darkness, so still believing that somewhere in the world, a man who had once been her enemy was whispering her name with the same gentle accent that had taught her what love truly means.